All right, perfect. So welcome to our in-service training focused on what makes therapy successful. So I'm super excited to have Meg, Garey, and Amy Morgan from A Better Chance for Our Children joining us. So Meg, I'll make that short and sweet and turn it right over to you.
Okay, perfect. So we are really excited to be here to talk about therapeutic approaches because it is a broad topic and we're going to hope and try to give you information that will help you support the parents you're working with and the children you're working with. So I'm going to share my screen to pull up the PowerPoint, and then Amy and I will do introductions and then get the show on the road. So many of you may have been in trainings with me before, but if not, I am Meg Garey. I am Executive Director of A Better Chance for Our Children. And as an agency, we provide adoption, post-adoption, and foster care services throughout the state of Delaware. And we are, and we also have a therapist contracted with us. And one of them is Amy Morgan. So I'm going to let her introduce herself and then we'll get going.
Sure. My name is Amy Morgan and I am a therapist with ABC. I have had the privilege of working for the agency as a caseworker as well as I was working on my therapy license. So I feel like that was a very helpful way to continue learning about foster care and adoption. And as I transitioned, I fully transitioned a couple of years ago, and now I am doing therapy services full time.
Excellent. So it'll be great to have Amy's expert knowledge as we go through. I'm going to start just by going through sort of laying the foundation. And then Amy will dive in more specifically about what kinds of approaches are helpful and what kinds of things are helpful to ask, etc. So, broadly speaking, we're going to be talking about our kids and just to set the stage, what that means to us, you know, for who we work with, it's kids who have experienced foster care and or adoption. And we want to, again, sort of set the stage that even a child who joined their family at a young age is going to struggle in some way. And some of the reasons are listed here and what we're going to talk about. Some of it's about trust and attachment because of their early life experiences, grief and loss, because that is a common factor through every single foster care and adoption experience, every single one. There's always grief and loss. Rejection and shame can be significant issues for our kids because of their early experiences, because of their experience of being separated from birth family. They can have more sensitive sort of buttons around rejection and shame. There can be an impact on brain development, and then there can also be an impact because of prenatal drug and alcohol exposure. And we're not going to get into a lot of detail on all of those, but wanting to just talk about why some of our kids struggle, because it's important to keep in mind that regardless of the age, regardless of the circumstances, there's a lot of loss and that can bring up challenges, and there can be some other impacts. So wanting everyone to hold on to this fact that, no matter the age, a child experiences loss when they're separated from their birth mother. And even if the situation is quote unquote bad, they still experience that loss. And even if the new situation is quote unquote better, they're still going to grieve. And, we do our best to give them space to do that. And that's true even when they're teeny tiny, they still experience that loss and there's still an impact on them. I like this quote from The Glass Castle because it brings a lot of that together, which is the idea of ambiguous loss, which can be sort of defined as a physical absence, but psychological presence. And so this, I think, just speaks to that. One of the hardest things you will ever have to do, my dear, is to grieve the loss of a person who is still alive. And for our kids, that can mean parents, grandparents, cousins, siblings, whoever it may be, previous caregivers. And it's one of the reasons why our kids struggle and why sometimes the healing takes a long time. And it's important to recognize that even when a child has been with a family for a long time, and even when the family is doing a lot of great, good things, they'll still struggle. Because adoption is, and it's a very important milestone, but doesn't have magical healing powers. And so we have to hold on to why they struggle. And some of it's the impact on brain development. And it can also be a part of how long they experience trauma or chronic stress. So we believe as an agency, based on our experience over the decades, that for every year a child lives in trauma or chronic stress, which can include their time in foster care, it's going to take about 3 years for them to quote unquote heal. I put healing in quotes because it has the connotation that it's final, which it is not. But for them to really sort of be making that significant progress where the things that come up for them don't impact them as much, or they are more easily managed, etc. And so because of all those things, it's important to find the right support. Mental health services can be really, really helpful, but finding the right fit can be really, really difficult because not all providers understand our kids' experiences and challenges, and they can look for trauma informed because that's what we tell them to do. That's a really broad term. It might not necessarily reflect the capacity that a family needs, because you could have a therapist who's trained broadly in trauma or in a specific kind of traumatic experience that is not necessarily relevant to our kids, right? So we want to make sure that whoever's working with our kids has experience and understanding around attachment challenges, the impact of those early childhood experiences, understanding developmental trauma. And so if not, parents can get unhelpful advice, which can lead to frustration all around. So that's why I'm glad that we're able to talk about this today, because it's an important topic. So I want to pause. I know I haven't gone very far, but I still want to pause to see if there are any questions. And Amy, you're always welcome to hop in and add if there's something you want to contribute while I'm laying the foundation. So any questions yet? Okay. Oh, was there a question?
Yeah. How would you identify the type of support? I mean, maybe like the school psychologist, school nurse, school social worker. Where would you start to identify the type of right service that you're talking about or support?
Yeah. One of the things we'll talk about is sort of the questions that should be asked. And I think it can be any and all of those people, right? I think it can be a school support. It can be an outside therapist. It can be a school social worker, whoever it is who has the best sort of knowledge and experience that fits that child's needs and is willing and able to assist. Let's utilize them because there are different kinds of supports that will help children in different ways. And we're going to talk about that in terms of maybe it's occupational therapy. Maybe we need to address some like health issues that will also help a child. And so we will get into that more at the end in terms of, okay, what do we look for essentially? Yeah. So we'll get to that. And if you feel like within that we haven't sort of gotten to your question, Joyce, make sure that I come back to it. But there should be some good stuff for you. Okay. So very briefly, we're just going to break down the fact that, all trauma is not created equal. And I recognize that a lot of you probably already have a lot of great trauma knowledge. So we're just going to briefly talk about the difference between what we're sort of calling single event trauma or quote unquote standard trauma don't like to call trauma standard, but we want to highlight the difference between that and developmental trauma, because developmental trauma is what most of our kids have experienced. So if we look at the single event trauma, is going to be, as it says on the screen, you know, a single event, maybe a natural disaster, a single assault, a single accident, and that person will have sort of explicit fear-based memories, and some transient changes in their regulation, their behavior, their stress reactivity. But if it's a person who has some support, and has some natural resilience and has some attachment, then they will be able to, you know, work through it in a different way than a person who's experienced developmental trauma. So developmental trauma is that early life trauma or chronic stress, and the caregiver is either the cause or unable to reduce the trauma or stress. And that experience leads to an impact or leads to changes in the way a child's brain develops, their attachment system, and those are things that they carry with them. So I want to give two sort of quick examples, and then we'll break it down a little bit more. So if we take Jenny, age 5, who survived a severe car accident, she broke several bones and it traumatized her. But she's had no other significant trauma in her life. She doesn't have a lot of big, you know, ongoing stress. She's got a stable caregiving situation. That's Jenny. Now we take Jeremy, age 5, who Jeremy was exposed to drugs in utero. He had inconsistent caregiving in his early life and experienced neglect and abuse. So Jenny, age 5, has experienced trauma. Jeremy, age 5, has experienced trauma. But those traumas have been very different and therefore have very different impacts on them on an ongoing basis. And so we can think about Jenny as the sort of standard trauma and then Jeremy as the developmental trauma. Wanted to quickly talk about ACEs, which is probably something that you've heard about. It's the adverse childhood experiences. It may have been expanded now, but the original study identified these 10 types of ACEs. So there's the personal, and then there's the ones related to family members. So the personal adverse childhood experiences are physical abuse, verbal abuse, sexual abuse, physical neglect, and emotional neglect. And then the family ones are a parent who's an alcoholic, a parent who's a victim of domestic violence, a family member in jail, a family member diagnosed with a mental illness, and the disappearance of a parent through divorce, death, or abandonment. So I think you could all take a minute and reflect on children you've worked with, stories you know, and think about the number of ACEs that they've had, and recognize that those adverse childhood experiences have an ongoing impact on mental health and physical health. So developmental trauma, coming back to that, it is categorically different than your standard trauma because it changes the early wiring in our brains. We're going to talk a little bit about the brain stuff, so I'll dive into that in just a minute. It leads to mistrust. So the first phase of development, according to Erik Erikson and his psychosocial stages of development, is birth to 18 months, and it's trust versus mistrust. So what a child is doing in that time is figuring out, can they trust the people and the world around them, or do they have to develop mistrust because they need to be on alert for danger? And so for a lot of our kids, what they learned in that early 18 months is mistrust because the people around them were inconsistent or scary or both, or were unable to meet their needs or did not meet their needs in a nurturing way. Because it's one thing to feed a baby and to look at them and to smile and to be engaged. It's another thing to feed a baby and be watching TV or yelling at someone or having a sort of flat face, because kids pick up on those things and it triggers their alarm system. And so their alarm system learns to be on alert when they have that early developmental trauma. It also can lead to implicit and pre-verbal fear memories, which essentially means it happens before their brain is sort of developing and holding on to conscious memories, because that part of the brain is still developing. And that means that I may have responses to things based on memories that I'm not going to be able to pull, right? So if I'm a year old and I get bit by a dog, I may have a fear response later in life to a dog, but I'm not going to know that that's because of my, experience of being bit by a dog when I was 1, because that's not a conscious memory for me. It's an implicit and pre-verbal fear memory. And so that happens for our kids, and it's hard to predict when something like that might come up. So one of the examples we give is a kid who, is in class, teacher leans over to answer a question, and kid, just automatically just hauls off and hits teacher, because teacher's leaning over and teacher wears the same perfume as somebody who hurt him. And so his brain says, must defend. And it is an automatic reaction. And that's because of an implicit and pre-verbal fear memory. And as I said already, it puts the brain on defense. And that can be a freeze or hide response. It can be hypervigilance, right? That's sort of always on alert for potential harm. And perhaps a child can experience what's called safety blindness, which is essentially the idea that even if there aren't any sort of actual threats, there are still going to be those perceived threats. And a caregiver can be doing all the great things, but they may be blind to that. And so that's why it can be very challenging for our kids to sort of move on from those difficult experiences, is because they've had that developmental trauma. Their brain, the wiring of their brain has been impacted. Their attachment system has been impacted. And they may be having sort of memories and reactions to things that they can't name, and therefore, we can't name for them either. So I'm going to pause again for questions before I launch into a sort of brief. I'm going to try and be brief. I don't do a great job necessarily when we talk about the brain stuff, because I love it so, but I'm going to pause before we have a brief discussion about impact on brain development. Okay, great. Let's keep going. Okay, brain development and functioning. We want to talk about this because we can't understand our kids until we understand their brains. And we can't find the right support for them if we don't understand their brains. So that's why we want to just remember some of these things as we're going through. So the basics. The brain has already begun to grow at 5 weeks after conception. And by 8 weeks, the basic structure of the brain is in place. That's why we need to not just think about what happens from birth forward. We have to include that prenatal time, because if during that time they were prenatally exposed to drugs or alcohol, that is going to impact their brain development. If mom has experienced a significant amount of stress, that will also impact their brain development. So if you think about the histories that you read, and perhaps that mom was experiencing struggles with joblessness, transient housing, perhaps in a violent relationship, whatever it may be, mom's experiencing a lot of stress, means baby gets flooded with stress hormones, which signals to the brain that it has to be on alert. It has to be ready for that stress, because that's the message that it's getting. And so baby comes into the world already wired to be on alert for that stress. It impacts the way the brain develops. And So we want to hold that. And then from birth to 5, that is when the brain does a lot of most of its developing and growing. Obviously, we keep, getting more sophisticated with our brain functioning as we go along, but a lot happens in that first chunk of time. And so we need to reflect on what those early experiences were, because the higher functioning brain regions are meant to be growing rapidly. But if a child is on alert, and stuck in the lower part of their brain, we like to use the hand model of the brain. If they're stuck in the lower part of their brain, which you can see here, we sort of talk about as the brain stem and the limbic brain, they're not going to be building the good connections that kids should be developing at that time up to their executive functioning, which is the prefrontal cortex. The brain has to develop from the bottom to the top, right? You have to have the brain stem first, you have to have that survival first, and then you need to have your alarm system on, right? Because if you don't have any of those things, it doesn't matter what kind of fancy thinking you can do with the executive functioning of your brain, it doesn't matter, right? You have to be safe and you have to be alive. So those parts have to develop first. And so that's what's developing in those early years. And when a child is experiencing a lot of stress or trauma, that's what the brain gets wired for. So we talked about this, the brain develops from the bottom to the top. You can think of it like, building a house. You gotta lay the foundation, frame the rooms, and then install the wiring. So you have to do all of those things. And you guys know, if the sort of wiring isn't working well downstairs, it's supposed to make its way upstairs, well, that's not going to work, right? You're going to have flickering lights, you're going to have light switches that don't work, you're going to have all of those things. And so we really need to think about what's going on in the lower part of the brain if we're having some problems with the upper part of the brain. And it's about the connections. So because, experience is the architect of the brain, and it's a repetition of experiences that strengthens the brain's pathways. And so if I am having a repetition of experience that is telling me, again, to be on alert, or that it's not safe to connect to others, then that is what my brain will be learning, and that is what will work sort of the best. And it's about the relationships, right? We come into this world wired for connection because we have to be. We are helpless infants who need the people around us to keep us safe, to feed us, to make sure that we don't get sick, all of those things. So we come into the world wired for connection. And it's that stimulation, that care, those responsive relationships that help a child's brain grow and develop the way that it is meant to. And it's that sort of give and take. So when there is a disruption in that, it is hard on our kids, because when it goes well, a child learns that they can trust the people around them. Their needs will be met. And their needs will be met in an attuned, caring way most of the time, right? Most of the time is all we need. So that happens again and again, and then their brain can, wire itself well, and can focus on those things. It doesn't have to focus on the survival parts, because when it does not go well, again, a child learns they have to be on alert. They cannot trust that their needs will be met, and so the area of the brain focused on survival gets worked the most, so it works the best. Because it adapts just as easily to a negative environment as it does to a positive one. And yes, those pathways can be rewired. We need a lot of repetition, but those pathways can be rewired with good care and new experiences and learning to trust, all of that. The one exception to that is if there's significant damage due to prenatal drug or alcohol use, more specifically alcohol use, because it causes literal brain damage. So there will always be a limitation to the child's capacity because there's actual brain damage due to the substances used. again, the biggest impact is from alcohol use. Okay, so we've talked about this. I'm going to skip through it. You guys can read the slide real quick, and Lauren can send it out if she didn't already in the PDF. So again, you don't have to remember this specifically, but we just want to talk about the body's alarm system, which is the amygdala, and just remembering that it works very quickly and is very reactive to the face, the eyes, and the tone of voice. And so I know Amy can attest to this. Sometimes what we have to do is talk to parents about, like, what was your face doing? Because our faces do a lot of things that we don't necessarily know are happening. And aren't we all in a great time where this is all we get to see of somebody's face? And so it's that much harder for a child, and they're going to be on that much more alert because they only have this to assess what you're saying or doing or thinking or feeling. And so they're going to be on more alert because they're just not sure what's happening, because it works really quickly. And we don't always recognize, again, sort of what our face is portraying, or how it's perceived, because there have been studies about micro expressions. Everybody's familiar with that. And, if we take the angriest face to the happiest face, and we look at the sort of micro expressions in between, a child who's experienced, especially developmental trauma, significant trauma, they're going to see angry all the way through up until about, and I can't remember exactly, I apologize, but it's something high, like 70 to 80% of happy face. Right? So they're going to see angry all the way through angry, all the way through neutral, and all the way through a little bit happy, a little bit more happy, a little bit more happy. And not until it's happy face are they going to recognize that it is not a threat in a happy face. And so we want to be very aware of, again, what our face is doing, tone of voice, etc. Because our kids, oh boy, can they pick up on every little thing. And one of the examples I like to give is the idea of oh, I don't have this picture, sorry. What is your face doing? Because a furrowed brow, a thinking furrowed brow, is not very different from a angry furrowed brow, right? So really angry is our faces get very scrunched. But our faces also get scrunched when we're thinking, when we're listening. And so for a kid who's on high alert, they're going to see that, and it's going to trigger that alarm system to at least, not full alarm necessarily, but to at least be okay, what's happening? What's going on here? I think they might be getting mad. Are they getting mad? What do I need to do if they get mad? And that's not conscious thought. That's the alarm system in the amygdala, in the middle part of their brain. And so it's important that caregivers understand that, and the people supporting our kids understand that. Because, it's hard. There was a documentary years ago called Paper Tigers. And essentially it was about high school students who had a lot of ACEs and how they experienced them, and the fact that they couldn't tell, their brains couldn't tell the difference between a paper tiger or a real tiger. And it's a metaphor. So there's false alarms. And potentially problematic sort of reactive behavior because of those. And we want to think about our own experiences of that, right? We all can have panic responses to things that aren't actual threats. The example I give most, because it's one a lot of people are familiar with, is public speaking. That is something that can fill you with panic, but there's no actual threat. So think about sort of how you experience that in your body. What does that mean? And that is often what our kids are experiencing. And so this is just another way of sort of talking about some of the struggles that come with the changes in the early wiring of a child's brain, which is essentially because it has to, when the amygdala sort of puts off, sends the alarm, it shuts down the sort of access to the upper part of the brain, because if we're on alert for danger, we don't need to be thinking through our options, or, you know, as again, the other example I like to give, like, I wonder if that bear will attack me. Maybe not. What time of the year is it? Maybe it'll go to hibernation. Maybe it'll eat the bear. No, right? Bear, run, or yell, or whatever you're supposed to do to a bear, right? Like, no, we don't want to think it through. We have to go. Well, that becomes problematic when what a child is reacting to isn't a bear, but is a kid in the hallway, or a perceived threat at home. And we often expect kids to be able to use the thinking part of their brain when they literally have no access to it. And again, these are the kinds of things that we want to find, you know, we want to find providers who understand those kinds of things. Oh, I do. I like this quote a lot. Our brains are wired for connection, but trauma rewires them for protection. That's why healthy relationships are difficult for wounded people. The attachment injuries are the most profound because we don't have a safe base. We don't have someplace to go. And so our brains get rewired for protection. And we've been talking up until now about why that has such a big impact. And those attachment injuries and those early experiences, they also impact, what we can call sort of our internal working models. How do I view myself? How do I view the world? How do I view others? It all gets colored by those experiences. And then how do I attach in new relationships, different relationships throughout my life can be impacted by these early attachment injuries. I believe it's Dr. Bruce Perry, who some of you may have heard of before, who says, yes, our kids can learn the language of attachment, but they'll always speak it with an accent, right? They will carry the traces of their attachment injuries with them. Doesn't mean they're not going to be able to do it, but they're going to carry the traces of those attachment injuries with them. So because of all of these things, our kids can develop what's called blocked trust, which essentially means I have had to be on alert. I have learned that I cannot trust the people around me. And so I will not trust you, even when you are giving me no reason to not trust you. It's just going to be my automatic reflex response, because that's what I'm going to do to keep myself safe, right? It's what anybody's brain would do in any situation of a repeated pattern. We're going to learn to avoid that pattern. So if I've had a repeated pattern or repeated experience of not being able to trust the people around me, then why would I keep trying? And it's literally going to change like the chemicals in the brain, the receptors in the brain, and shift that system. And so it's going, again, all the things we've talked about in terms of needing the repetition of new experiences and the consistent caregiving and people who understand that this is what is happening is going to be very important. Was there a question?
Yes.
Go ahead.
I was wondering, say, for example, if a child had been sexually abused by an outsider, but had learned to lie to their parents, does this impact the trust they have for their parents because they know from an early age they lied, even if the incident was maybe half a dozen times or once?
So I think broadly speaking, yes, right? So you're saying that the child lied to their parents about it?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. So that will trigger the shame button, which, so if it's Brene Brown, who has done a lot of research on shame, has talked about like our shame shields, like what we each do to sort of combat shame. So one of them is moving essentially like being aggressive towards another to try and, sort of combat my own feelings of shame. People pleasing, moving towards, and then the one is withdrawal. And so a person can do all of those things at any given time. But that's what it made me think of when you sort of asked that question. Like, yes, that can put up a barrier in a relationship, because however that child is going to manage the shame that they may feel, which I'm not saying they should feel shame, but is how we are often made to feel in those situations. Because they lied, because they quote unquote let it happen, or whatever their narrative may be. It often, and again, Amy can speak to this later, but what a child's narrative is a lot of where we need to meet them. Not only just because of the way narratives work in our brains, but also like we need to help them have a different view of the situation, to take out the shame, and to meet them there. Does that answer what you were asking?
Yes, yes, thank you.
You're welcome. So a lot of what we've talked about so far is the challenges. Imagine parenting a child with all of that, right? Who's in blocked trust, who's maybe consistently rejecting, or hard to attune to, because they send you mixed signals. One day it's this, one day it's this, one day it's that, one day it's that. A parent in that situation can develop, or a caregiver can develop blocked care, which essentially means that, their attachment system is impacted by trying to parent a child who is in blocked trust. There's a lot of wear and tear on the brain. And it makes it hard to keep going back and keep going back and keep going back. And so we want to be aware of what that may look like in a parent, and make sure that they are also getting support, that the support that they need while we're getting support that a child needs. All right, I'm going to pause again for questions, and then I will stop talking and let Amy do some talking. But first, want to see, does anybody have any additional questions? Oh, and with that, I'm going to let Amy take over. And Amy, I'll just click through as you want me to click through.
Sure. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about what our kids need now that we kind of have a little more of like the foundational pieces and some education on the brain and what experiencing trauma, like how it can impact our kids. So in working in finding the right support, it can be really difficult at times. The way our kids can present can look very purposeful and willful and very behavior based, when actually it's coming from a more complex place. Most providers don't have experience or expertise in foster care and or adoption. Parents may be looking for like that quicker fix, or feeling like what they're currently trying to manage, needing it to be resolved and worked through in the moment, when actually like this type of a therapeutic approach takes a long time and is a process. So kind of encouraging families and parents that, this is not a quick process. And a child may need more than mental health services. So for example, like Meg had mentioned, they might need some type of occupational therapy, or some type of a support to help to support like the nervous system. A lot of our kids come with regulation needs, and sensory type of issues. I have a lot of kids I work with who have like a lot of eating challenges just because in that like early, like 18 month or yeah, like from birth to 18 months, you know, having that lack of consistency and, you know, not really developing that skill. So I have a lot of kids in feeding therapy. I have a lot of kids going to some type of like a theraplay, like, or something that is very movement type of based, and that has been really helpful. The other thing I talk with my families about, Meg, if you could put it on the next slide for me, is if they're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. So many of my kids struggle like with food and kind of having the proper nutrition type of support. And I don't know about any of you, but when I am hungry, I get hangry. So like just even looking at those kinds of needs of, okay, what do they need in that moment? Do they need some water? Do they need something to eat? Are they tired? A lot of my kids also have trouble sleeping at night. So like we talk about that to see what type of support, because rest is a really good time for like the body to kind of heal and to rework itself. So that's an important time. So not only looking at the behaviors, but looking at, okay, what does the type of daily life look like? And are there some types of things that we can help to tweak? And so just making sure that they need the fuel, because that's what the brain and the nervous system works off of, right? Like it needs like that daily fuel. It needs proper nutrition. It needs proper resources. So if they're only eating carbs or only eating like super sugary snacks, or things that are going to burn really quickly, then they don't have like the proper resources then like to regulate, and it's going to throw off their nervous system. So I am a very big component of you know, looking at those kind of daily intake needs, and talking about that with families. So on the next slide, there's a quote by Dr. Ross Green. It says, "Your explanation guides your intervention." So from my personal approach, I take a lot of time in the beginning to kind of gather as much information as I can to kind of help to learn more about what is going on, and what this child or children in the family are kind of working with, so that I can have more like of a complete picture, and that really helps me to help them if I can have like as much information as possible. So in trying to find the right help, I think with our children, it is important for the provider to have a strong understanding on developmental trauma, how that impacts the brain, and kind of how that is approaching the therapeutic relationship. When I first start to work with kids, I do like a lot of bottom up type of approaches. So I work mainly with like the lower brain. So how can we help like to kind of to help the nervous system regulate more, right? Because we're not going to get anywhere if the nervous system isn't regulated. So that's kind of where I go first. So I do a lot of play. I do a lot of like art and like sensory type of things, music and rhythm, just kind of helping the child to have some kind of body awareness. Because a lot of our kids can kind of like shut off that connection to their body. So even just kind of spending time to kind of learn, like, where do you feel like emotions in the body? What does that feel like? Putting language to it, because you know, a lot of children experiencing developmental trauma really have a tough time like identifying what's happening in their body and what that feels like, and what is happening. So then a lot of times it just comes from it can lead to like a quick automatic reaction because there's just not like an understanding of what is happening. So that's kind of where I tend to start. And then I kind of move up. So in looking at the limbic part of the brain, I still do, you know, a lot of play, and just kind of helping to then be able to connect to the higher level. So like in the cortex and like the prefrontal cortex, those type of approaches. There are a lot of providers who are trained in trauma-focused CBT. And I will say for some kids, it can be a helpful approach, but I feel like with our kids, it's a tricky one because I feel like, you know, having that safety and connection and kind of being able to fully reflect and work on their narrative takes a lot of time. So that's not a place I typically start, just because it's kind of like how Meg said earlier, that like if we were to have that as our first approach, I think we're just going to really frustrate everybody because we don't have the foundation of what's underneath. So I do incorporate narrative work and storytelling and things like that, but it tends to come a little later. And when we kind of have like a sense of safety and attachment and kind of trust and relationships a little bit more built, and kind of having like those lower parts of the brain kind of a little more settled. So just as I said, children who have experienced early trauma will need a bottom-up approach. So that kind of focusing on the lower portions of the brain. Just a repeat, so like a top-down cognitive type of an approach, really, for the most part. Like I won't say never, but I have seen for the majority that is just not a helpful type of an approach for our kids. Lots and lots of focus on attachment. I incorporate a lot of attachment work, a lot of play, and just you know, helping the child to really be able to trust, and keeping that as like my guiding star of, okay, so we can't really do anything else if we don't have like that first safety and trust there. So that's my first overall focus. And another important thing to keep in mind is that therapy and treatment needs to include like a family therapy component. It's going to look a little different depending on the case and what's happening, but this is not just a child problem, right? Like it's a family. You know, looking at everybody in the home and things like that. So it's not just working with the child, although a lot of times they are the like identified client, but including all like of the other connections in the home and relationships, that needs to be a part of this, because we are looking at the attachment, we are looking at trust, and it's a component that is needed. Okay, so empowering parents to advocate. It's important that we empower parents to ask questions and to advocate for their child. A parent should change providers if it is not a good fit. The therapeutic relationship is a key component. So that's what I tried to work on first, is kind of building that relationship and rapport, because that's going to be like the major foundation. And no one should settle for a therapist. So I know Meg had mentioned, well, what should parents or people working with the child be looking for, or like what type of questions should they be asking? So if a provider is labeled trauma informed, parents should ask about what their framework is and their trainings, and what type of resources, and the foundation of their trauma knowledge. As Meg had stated earlier, trauma can be very broad, and there are a lot of providers out there who claim to be trauma informed, but take a very different approach than what the child actually needs. So just making sure to ask those type of questions of what they plan to do, like in therapy sessions, what type of things will they be working on, and their training and what they feel is important. So that's an important piece to keep in mind. With our kids, asking about a provider's experience working with foster and adoptive families. I feel like that's a really important one. I know there are many well-meaning therapists out there who want to give good advice and want to help, but I think sometimes can give not good advice, or can kind of give advice that kind of goes against working on the relationship or working on the attachment. So just making sure it's a provider who has that knowledge. Also asking about brain-based approaches to treatment, since that's where we really like to focus on, and asking about their understanding of the impact of prenatal exposure to drugs and alcohol, since that's pretty much most of our kids, not all, but it is a big percentage. So making sure that the provider does have that knowledge. So just a couple more suggestions. Asking the provider about modalities other than just typical talk therapy. I will say pretty much every child on my caseload struggles with only talk therapy. So there has to be other type of modalities or ways to help the connection and working, because just the traditional talk therapy approach, I think it can just trigger too much of the vulnerable, and a lot of our kids don't have the language to what had happened to them, and so it just can cause a lot of frustration. And then this is a list of just some other other approaches and kind of modalities that can be used in conjunction. So we don't have to go through all of them, but these can be really helpful approaches that can help working with the nervous system and working with rewiring the brain, and working with like the play like aspects, and can be really good components. So just wanted to provide those. And then family work. Any therapy with one of our kids must include family work. And as I stated, this will look a little different based on the child and like the circumstances. If the provider does not agree with this view, then they might not be the right fit. I don't see how you could do this type of a therapy approach without incorporating family work. It just kind of seems impossible to me. But so keeping that in mind of what the provider would be willing to do is important. Parent work. Parents often can do well with their own type of a support. This may include individual therapy or couples therapy. However, this may be too much in the moment to have them engage in their own type of therapy, just to, like if things are really busy or like there's a lot happening, or if they're just not in the right place to do so, that can be a lot to ask. Parenting a child with significant challenges takes a toll on caregivers, and it is important for a provider to understand why parents struggle. I typically do refer parents to try to get their own support. Not everyone is able to, but I do think it is a good component to this type of a treatment, as well as the provider being open to maybe connecting with the other therapist, if that's okay, like with the parent, but just trying to provide as much of a support as possible. And you can't force therapy, even when we know how much a child or parent needs it. If they're not ready, then we just have to give them some time. Pushing therapy may end up doing more harm than good, and our kids often have had no control over what has happened, so they take control when they can get it. So sometimes, a child just might not be ready, and that's okay. Like, we can look at other ways of supporting the family, seeing if we can connect them to the adoption community, or like what other supports can be. But if a child isn't ready, it isn't helpful to push them. So just keeping that in mind. And Meg had put a pause for questions. So any questions about the therapeutic approach with our kids?
I had two questions. This is John Cusack. One is, at what age can you begin to evaluate a child for trauma and other adverse effects? And secondly, when would you start intervening? Are they the same time period? I mean, what age would you actually start to evaluate a child? And if you found some issues, when would you begin therapy or some sort of intervention?
So that's a good question. Trying to think, like the youngest I've worked with is like 3. So like 3 up. I think I think it also, and Meg can also jump in on this too, but you know, looking at like what the goal is, because I think, you know, for younger kids, they can do well with like a play therapy type of an approach, because it isn't so much based on language, and there's other ways of kind of providing support. But you know, like I don't think there's a clear-cut age for for therapy to start. I think it's like looking at what the child needs in that moment and kind of like what the goal like of therapy would be. Is that making sense?
About that, I was just gonna add real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
My slides got angry. That for if they are younger, like the little ones, and are clearly having some bigger reactions to things than your typical toddler, etc. I think what that work is parent work, right? So it's about helping a parent to understand how to best regulate that child, respond to that child, support that child. Because Amy's right, you know, when they're that little, when they're 1 or 2 years old, you're going to be limited in what Amy could sit and do with a child. But parent work and like parenting approaches work, I think is something. And in terms of like when you can start assessing, it depends on whether you're asking like formally or informally, right? Like, because from a formal evaluation perspective, there are behavioral questions within there, right? So you'll get a sense of, is what a child, you know, demonstrating, is it outside the norm? And if it's outside the norm, we have to wonder why. And if we look at their history, we can make those connections. So was there an additional question, Joyce? Did you? Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned about attachment. What does that typically look like? What would you do, I mean, in the instance to foster that?
Amy, do you want to take that one, or you want me to?
So I mean, it's so I do a lot of like attachment based type of interventions when I'm doing it in session. So just looking at okay, like if a child is struggling in a relationship and struggling to feel like a sense of safety or a trust with a provider, looking at ways to kind of like help to promote that. So, you know, some kind of ways are like doing like little playful games, right? Like having like those moments of joy, doing things with some eye contact or kind of like mirroring, right? So to kind of help with like the mirror neurons, right? So that the child can feel, you know, what the parent like, or like the caregiver, you know, help them to see what the parent like is feeling about them, and you know, try to help to create that what's called like attunement. So having, you know, them like in sync with each other. So like we do like certain activities like mirroring or copycat, or you know, like just kind of like some playful activities. If the child's able to tolerate it, we'll do some type of like a touch, or you know, something like with the hair, or the, you know, because like a lot of our kids have a tough time like with touch, so like it really depends, you know, on like where the child is at that point. But you know, like looking at how can we continue helping to build the trust in this relationship that isn't language based, right? Because if the caregiver is going to say, you know, like just in words, you know, like, which is also good, right? For the caregiver to say, you know, this is like a safe environment. You like, we will keep you safe, you know, so those are good, but it's not hitting all of the parts of the brain and all like of the parts of the nervous system. So kind of incorporating other things that can help to kind of build that attachment.
And I would add from this sort of I don't provide therapy, but talk to parents a lot, that I often talk to them about the things that you may have to set aside because they're not important right now, and you have to focus on connection, right? I understand that chores are important. I understand that homework is important. I understand that rules are important. Get it. Sometimes we need to focus on connection first, and then we can come back to those things. And so that is what that is about, is building that attachment, is helping create safety in the relationship so that the child can be open to the attachment, right? Like creating safety so they can be open to attachment, whatever, you know, form that takes. And there are times, and I would suggest that maybe they do this with some guidance, but there's also a book, and maybe Amy uses it. It's I Love You Rituals by Becky Bailey, I think, which breaks it down in sort of different categories of things that you can do, that you can build in connection. If it's just something that, you know, a little thing you do every day when they come home from school, or a little bedtime thing, and it doesn't have to be hugging or holding. It can be different things, just connection pieces. So those are good things, you know, within therapy, but also things that I just talk to parents about, you know, outside of that as well.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions, Lauren? I think you had one from before. Not sure if anybody else does.
I do.
Oh, Carol, go ahead.
Well, I'm just curious, do you have like a list of trauma-based therapists that are in Delaware? Because it's my understanding there really aren't a lot, and I may be incorrect in that, but I know I've asked for that before, and they weren't able to find one.
You are correct that it is a limited pool that is available. So as an agency, what we have done is we keep a list. It's not a formal list, it's a list that we keep of folks in Delaware who we know have worked well with our families, and or we know that they've had some of the same training or experiences, learning experiences that we know are really helpful for our kids. So there's not a formal list that exists, maybe someday, but yes, we keep a list. So if you would like assistance, please feel free to reach out.
Thank you.
Amy's on the list.
Meg, it's Lauren. I do have one question. And actually, maybe this question is more for Amy. But Amy, you were chatting earlier about, you know, you can't force therapy. Sometimes that does more harm than good, and finding the right therapist. For CASAs that are working with children who are reluctant to engage in therapy or are just non-participatory, what kind of tips or tricks or, you know, should CASAs do, or what's kind of the best way for a CASA to handle that situation for a child who's not really willing or open to engage in therapy?
So I can start just a little bit, let Amy jump in, and a lot of it's just sending the messages again and again that this is your choice. Like, yes, this is something that has been identified as a resource, and these are the reasons why we think it would be helpful. We also recognize that no one can force you into therapy or can force you to like a therapist. So I think telling them again and again that it is their choice, and if they feel like the person isn't the right fit, we'll do what we can to find one who is. So tell me. And sometimes, you know, you're still going to get the oppositional, like, but sometimes they may say, well, I want someone who's more playful, or I want someone who isn't going to stare at me, or I want, like, I don't know what it is, right? But try and empower them to decide, you know, without a lot of pressure. You know, I like planting a seed and coming back. So like, here are the reasons why I think this would be good. I would love for you to think about it. And then next time we talk, why don't you tell me what came to you in terms of what you would be interested in, or what would help you, be open to it, or what have you. Amy?
Yeah, and just to piggyback off of that, I think a lot of times our kids feel like coming to therapy means that there's like something wrong with them. So I think also, maybe if like the provider like is open to it, like connecting with the provider and seeing like what type of an approach they would use for that, or how it can be worded to the child or things like that, because I think how it's approached is an important component, because I do think there is that kind of like, well, I'm coming to see you because there like is something wrong with me, and I get that a lot, and so we work with that and like we talk about it, and also like because it's hard for kids to look like long term of like, okay, like what is the goal of this, and what's like the purpose of this, and if I end up feeling better, or if I seem to do a little better, then that can also be scary. So looking at learning new ways of like coping and handling things is also pretty scary for like our kids. So it takes a lot to kind of build up that trust and rapport. So like, I think if the therapist is open to working with you and just kind of like having that conversation of, well, how would I like approach this, like, to help the child to feel more that this is a supportive relationship for them and not because there's something wrong with them. Like, I think that's also a really helpful piece.
And I think building, again, going back to the approaches that we've talked about as being most helpful, when it's not talk therapy, they are like, I would guess, somewhat more likely to engage, right? When it's not somebody asking a question that they have to answer, and somebody asking a question that they have to answer. And maybe they play a game while they do that, but it's still somebody asking a question that they have to answer. So I think the more, again, you're finding different kinds of approaches, or, with the body movement or equine therapy or whatever it may be, I think that helps. And being aware that they just may have a very limited like window of tolerance. So maybe it's that you offer, okay, today, all we want to do is have 5 minutes of, this will be painfully slow, I understand. But today, maybe all we do is 5 minutes of getting, like, saying hi to this person. And then maybe next week it's 10 minutes, right? Like, respecting their window of tolerance and helping them build up, I think is something that we should also, be thoughtful about, because it's the same argument sometimes I have, like, that in schools, that kids they're all expected to sit still and work one way and learn one way, right? Well, not we see therapy as something that has to happen one way, that they have to go the entire time, they have to talk and they have to answer when a question is asked. And okay, well, let's maybe take a different approach to that. And Amy can tell me if she thinks that's terrible, because as a therapist, but I think, again, we have to perhaps think outside of what has been the box.
Yep. No, I completely agree, Meg. I think because each kid is going to be different, and each, and our goal is to get them the support that they need and to build that connection. So how do we go about doing that? And that is not going to look the same for every single kid.
I have a question. Whenever you're talking about a parent and a child in therapy, when there's a parent, what happens if a parent might be undergoing some kind of trauma in his or her life, and then there's that provider, and then the parent suddenly decides that this provider is not the person that they would want to have in their child's life? So how do you know that parent is not projecting some trauma within themselves You know, and then the child's trauma is kind of like clouded over because of the parents. So how do you know?
Yeah, I think it's not always easy to know. And one of the reasons why we want to be throughout the journey focusing on parent support and really checking in and really assessing, because I think you do get to know that, right? Like some parents you're going to have a sense of what might be going on and encouraging that support from them and then navigating it appropriately. I don't know, Amy, if you were going to say something different, but I just think you won't always know. And you may have parents who bounce from therapist to therapist because they're waiting for one that will tell them what they want to hear. And I think Amy has often been in the position of very gently trying to tell parents something they do not want to hear, which is usually you're going to have to do some changing too. And they may bounce to try and find a therapist who's just going to fix their kid and hand them back. And all we can do is just continue to try and talk to them about these kinds of things, of why it's helpful to find these kinds of supports, etc. Amy, do you want to add anything?
No, like I think you're spot on. I mean, I think, you know, each case is going to be different. And I think, you know, it's hard to know that. And, you know, I have had many parents who have wanted to go and find another provider. And, you know, it's unfortunate, but, you know, also looking at, okay, that's the choice that we are making. And, you know, continuing to provide like the support, like an education as possible. But, you know, for some people, that is just the choice that they make. So it's just hard to know.
Yeah, I would think so.
And the tough answer is there are times where there's nothing we can do about that, right? Like we watch them walk away. And so I'm sorry, I don't mean to be such a downer, but that's the tough answer.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Anything else, Lauren, that you feel like maybe we didn't cover? Okay. So I do want to talk about post-adoption services. I know you guys are working with families while a child is still experiencing foster care, but you're also working with them, hopefully, you know, perhaps getting to a permanency status. And maybe they reach out after the fact. And so I just want to make sure that everybody's aware of post-adoption services. I think everybody is, but also there are 3 agencies providing those services. So I just want to run down what that looks like and see if you have any questions about that. So the basics, which hopefully you're all aware of, is that post-adoption services are available to any family living in Delaware that has adopted. So if you live in Delaware, you've adopted, you are eligible for post-adoption services. You're also eligible for post-adoption services if you've gotten permanent guardianship of a child who was in the Delaware foster care system. So any of the families you're working with qualify. The services are available until a child turns 18, or if they're still in high school, you know, it's the same as the sort of foster care rules. If you're not sure if a family or a child falls into the right category, please reach out. Also, if you happen to encounter, you know, because maybe just in your personal life, you're encountering families that may need support, but you're not sure if they qualify, then just reach out, because exceptions can be made and it's worth checking. So A Better Chance for Our Children, our agency, is one of the agencies providing post-adoption services. So this slide includes the array of services. I think especially for the discussion we've had today, I want to really highlight the importance of the parent and teen support groups. So we have a monthly support group that is, there's one based in our Wilmington office and one based in our Milford office. Right now, parents can attend via Zoom, and then our Wilmington office that is hybrid, so they can attend in person or via Zoom. And childcare is provided if it's in person. the importance of that space is being able to freely share with people who actually understand where you're coming from, and to get support from people who have lived it, right? And so not only is it facilitated by an adoptive parent, but that's who's around the room. And I will say, if you're working with parents and they haven't finalized an adoption yet, fine, they can come. They don't have to have finalized. They can attend before. And so encourage it now. Even if they say, oh, we're doing okay, great. Then make this connection so that when things are challenging, you already have the relationship. You already know where to go. It makes it that much easier because, okay, who's been overwhelmed, in a tough spot, really needing some help, but having a hard time asking for it or accessing it because you don't have the energy to do so? I've been there. I'm sure all of you have, and our parents get there. So the more we can connect them ahead of time, the better it will be. They'll be able to reach out when challenges arise. And if it's not to us as the professionals, it might be to other parents that they connected to in the group. And sometimes those parents contact us. I've had that. And so encouraging that as much as possible, I think, is very important. And then for our teen group, that is a nice space for teens to be with other teens who have maybe had similar experiences, who've also been adopted. And then it's the same thing in our childcare room, you know, even for the younger kids, that they just get to be around kids and families that are similar to theirs. So you see on the slide a range of other services. You know, one thing that can be difficult for families is sort of navigating those birth family connections. What do I do when my kid has questions? What do I do when their birth mother reaches out for and wants to have pictures or wants to meet or wants to do those things? How do I do that? We can help because those things are complicated. And I can't give you an answer because every case is different. And so we wanted to build that in as something that we could offer to families and be there as a support. Same with sibling support. It can be hard when you have multiple children in a family and perhaps one or more, but one of them has a harder time than the others. How does that impact the other kids? So providing some support around that. Then we have some parent coaching, which is just more intensive, you know, focused parent support, some teen mentoring, some respite and childcare, ongoing trainings and workshops similar to this, but for parents. So we have one a month with rotating topics, and think it's, again, very valuable to have that ongoing learning because, you know, parents sit through those preparation classes, but that could have been a very long time ago. And sitting through a class thinking hypothetically about something is very different than living it. So that ongoing training can be a really good support to come back to some of that information and knowledge. And then general case management or crisis support, right? So if a parent needs assistance going to a school meeting or accessing a resource, you know, we can be there for that. And then we do have therapists who provide services out of our Wilmington office, such as Amy and two others. So that is our array. And the information here for accessing it includes, so calling the Wilmington office and asking for me, or calling the Milford office and asking for our supervisor there, Cindy Knapp, and or just emailing me or emailing Lauren to connect to me. One way or another, you'll find me, and we're happy to assist and answer questions. So one of the other agencies providing post-adoption services is Children and Families First. They have therapy services available. Specifically, they also have functional family therapy. They provide case management. They have monthly trainings, and then they can also provide My Life. So that service that you guys know about that kids can get in foster care, we can also provide it post-adoption, because sometimes there are new challenges that come up, or maybe they were younger and didn't really work through their story. Now they're a little bit older and it's the time to do it. So we can assist with that. And then the third agency is Children's Choice. They also have case management, some respite, support groups. Theirs is in cycles. So they have 6 weeks and then a break, and then 6 weeks and then a break. and then ongoing training. And so the 3 agencies providing the services are obviously all agencies that function in Delaware as foster care and adoption agencies, but it doesn't matter if a family has worked with an agency before, they don't have to access post-adoption services through that agency. So if there's something that we are offering that a family wants, it's okay if they had worked with Children's Choice or CFF, et cetera. That part is not relevant post-adoption. Okay, so I'm going to pause again for questions and then see what wrap up maybe Lauren has. Other questions? No? All right, Lauren, once again, we did it so well.
I know, I love it. You ladies are awesome. Thank you so much for doing this. I definitely appreciate it.